ingredients. So bread made all over the world with all kinds of different ingredients. Generally you need, unsurprisingly, a flour, a liquid and some salt. It's pretty much the three non-negotiables with bread. Some places in Italy there is no salt in bread and the bread is disgusting as a result, so I wouldn't recommend leaving salt out of bread. But for the most part, in the sort of Western baking tradition, we use wheat flour, but there's a whole cornucopia of charming flour types even within that. So we've got some wholemeal plain flour. Plain obviously doesn't have raising agent added, unlike self-raising flour. That's the difference there. So self-raising flour has bicarbonate of soda or baking powder added to it. So you've got a leavening agent, which is useful for making cakes, less good for bread unless you're making something like a soda bread or a quick bread. So we want a plain flour. So that's wholemeal, plain flour, white plain flour. Weirdly, in Australia, the bags are a different colour. I've gone my whole life knowing that plain flour comes in red bags. Here it comes in blue bags, and self-raising comes in red. Still little differences. We've got some Italian bread making flour. So this is strong flour. So the key difference between what we'd call a bread flour and something that's an all-purpose flour, like the Americans would say, is how much protein that flour contains. That dictates how strong the flour is. So when you're making bread and you want it to rise, you need to develop gluten. And in order to develop gluten, you need lots of protein in the flour. Certain places in the world grow wheat that contains more protein. So the USA and Canada, for example, are great at growing strong wheat with lots of protein in it. Some varieties of wheat contain more protein than others. So if you're making bread that you want to rise, then much better to use something like a bread flour, a strong flour. And if you're making a flatbread, it really doesn't matter. You can use plain flour, it will work just as well. We've got some things here that aren't technically a wheat flour. So buckwheat flour, it's not a type of wheat, that's part of the name. Great for pancakes, not great for much else. It'll give your bread a little bit of a nutty taste if you've got some. You can chuck it in small amounts, but it doesn't develop gluten. It won't make a loaf of bread on its own, that's for sure. Spelt flour, so spelt's an ancient grain. It's much lower in gluten than wheat. It's good because it's more digestible than wheat, and if you are gluten intolerant, you could maybe get away with eating a sourdough spelt loaf because it will be that much lower in gluten than something wheaty. I've got some pasta flour here, so type 00 flour, doppio zero possibly. So this is somewhere between a bread flour and a plain flour in terms of its protein content. So with pasta you do need to develop some gluten, but obviously you're not leavening it, it's not rising, so the matrix of gluten that you form isn't as important. Liquids in bread, most often we're just going to be using water. Plain old tap water is fine, don't be wasting bottled water, particularly not in these uncertain times. Keep that in your cupboard just in case the world does go completely to shit. But water's not the only liquid we can use in bread. It's very common to add some kind of oil or fat to your bread. It extends the shelf life of your bread slightly, also gives you a slightly softer texture to your bread. If you just want the advantage of longer shelf life and better texture, just use plain vegetable oil, something like sunflower oil, canola oil, something with a neutral taste is great. If you're adding it for flavour as well, so maybe you're making an Italian focaccia, then by all means use your good quality olive oil. Otherwise, don't be wasting that on your bog standard white loaf. You can add milk to your bread instead or as well as water. This again, because it contains fat, gives you a slightly softer crumb. and a slightly richer taste. You can add beer to bread. This is brewed in Australian Guinness, 6%, tastes like arse. Perfect candidate for bread making. It was St Patrick's Day yesterday, should have checked the label before I bought this. Now I think it's probably going to go into bread. It's great because it adds a malty flavour to your bread. It will also make the colour a bit darker. Leavening agent, so we need something to make our bread rise. So for the most part we're going to be talking about yeast. So yeast is a type of fungus that exists pretty much all around us. This is a cultured strain of baker's yeast that's produced on a commercial scale and then is freeze-dried, essentially is what this is, freeze-dried fungus. Yum, yum, yum. Yeast is great because it takes the naturally occurring sugar in our flours and it eats them essentially, and it excretes alcohol and carbon dioxide. So we're less concerned about the alcohol when we're making bread. It's obviously very useful for brewers and people making wine and cider and whatever. For bread making we don't need to worry about it. We're not going to get pissed off our loaves because they're cooked at a temperature where obviously all the alcohol is going to be cooked off. But we are interested in the carbon dioxide. So when the yeast consumes those sugars and releases carbon dioxide, those bubbles get trapped in the gluten mesh that we formed by kneading our dough. And that's what makes the dough expand when it rises or proofs. So on to our final sort of essential ingredient, salt. We add salt to bread for a couple of reasons, mainly for taste. It makes things taste nicer. You do get some breads that are salt-free. There's a tradition in some parts of Italy to make bread without salt, but it doesn't taste quite as nice, to be honest. The other advantage is salt means that your gluten network or gluten matrix forms much easier. So, kind of a twofold advantage there. As a rule of thumb, we look to add about 2% of the weight of flour in our dough as salt. So if you're using 500 grams of flour, then you're going to be using 2% or 10 grams of salt.